The line started at the feed store and ran clear to the nail seller's wagon. 12 women by sunrise, 3 by noon, 1 by the time the church bell struck 2. Martha Greer stood where the others had stood on the same packed dirt under the same iron sky. But the others were gone, hired out to farm wives and widow keepers, and the new hotel man who needed someone with a soft face for the front desk. Martha's face had never been called soft. Her hands hadn't either. Mayor Hemlock walked the length of the empty table, his watch chain catching what little light the clouds allowed. He was a man shaped like a barrel left in the rain, too long swollen at the middle, soft at the seams. He stopped in front of Martha and looked up at her the way a man looks at a fence post he didn't order. 6 feet if she's an inch, he said to no one in particular, though half of Oakhaven had drifted over to watch. Hands like a teamster, back like a pack mule. He shook his head with the patient sorrow of a man forced to describe something unpleasant. What exactly does a body do with it? Laughter moved through the crowd, the way water moves downhill, easy, without effort. Martha's jaw did not move. Her eyes tracked a fixed point past Hemlock's left ear. At the base of her throat, a vein pressed against the skin and held. The crowd's attention began to dissolve. Men turned back toward the tavern. Women found errands. The show was over. Then Boots hit the boardwalk from the far end of the street, and the crowd reassembled itself without deciding to. He was tall in a way that had nothing to do with height, lean and dark-coated, moving like something that had spent too long in the kind of country where hesitation kills you. A scar ran from his left jaw to somewhere beneath his collar. The people of Oakhaven parted for him, the way they parted for weather, without welcome, without words, because arguing with either one was pointless. Gideon Cole, down from Blackwood Ridge, men said he trapped and hunted and was generally better left alone, which suited everyone fine since he felt the same about them. He stopped at the table. He looked at Martha for 3 full seconds, not at her face, not at her hands, but the way a man looks at a load he is calculating whether he can carry. Then he reached into his coat and dropped 2 coins on the wood. "Need somebody to split and stack before the ground freezes solid," he said. Nothing more than that. The crowd found this very funny. The mayor spread his hands in a gesture that said, "Well, who am I to stop a fool from wasting his silver?" Martha bent and picked up her bag. A flour sack faded to the color of old bone, holding what it held, and no more. She straightened and looked at Gideon Cole directly. She had gray eyes. They did not blink. "We should stop at Pruitt's before we leave town," she said. Her voice was level as surveyed ground. "The willow bark syrup. Clara will need it before the frost comes down hard, and Pruitt won't deliver up the ridge." The noise of Oakhaven continued around them. A dog barked somewhere on Mill Street. The clouds shifted, and the light changed for a moment, and then changed back. Gideon Cole did not move. His right hand had found the handle of the knife at his hip, not drawing it, just holding it. The knuckles had gone pale. The scar along his jaw pulled tight as the muscles beneath it locked. Nobody in that crowd heard what she said. They were already laughing at the next thing, already moving on, already forgetting the tall woman in the flour sack dress who couldn't find work in a town built on it. Nobody heard. But Gideon Cole was not nobody. Clara was 5 years old, and she had not left the cabin since September, and not one living soul in Oakhaven knew she existed at all. Pruitt's store smelled of camphor and old wood, and the particular sourness of a man who handled money all day and trusted none of it. Behind the counter, Pruitt himself said nothing when Martha and Gideon walked in. He didn't need to. His eyes did the arithmetic, the tall woman, the scarred man, the 2 coins, and he stepped back from the shelf where the medicine sat. Mayor Hemlock came through the door 40 seconds later. He hadn't hurried. Men like Hemlock never hurried. They moved at the speed of certainty because certainty never needed to run. Gideon Cole. He let the name sit in the air like a thing he'd caught. Didn't know you had a child up on that ridge. The store went quiet. 3 other men had followed the mayor in not for any reason they could name, just the way people follow when they sense something is about to happen and they don't want to miss it. Gideon stood at the counter. He did not turn around. That child, Hemlock continued, moving to the center of the room, living in whatever wreck of a cabin you've got up there. No schooling, no church, no woman of standing to see to her proper upbringing. He paused. That's a matter for the county, son. I'll have papers drawn up by Friday. The girl goes to the home in Calverton. Better for everyone. Martha was reading the label on the syrup bottle. She set it down on the counter without haste. Gideon turned then. His hand moved toward his hip. Every man in the room saw it. Every man in the room held his breath. Martha stepped in front of him. Not fast, not dramatic. She simply occupied the space between Gideon and whatever happened next, the way a wall occupies space without asking permission. She picked the bottle back up and placed it on the counter with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "How much?" she said to Pruitt. Outside, the noise started before anyone understood what it was: a deep crack of wood, a grinding of iron, then shouting in the flat tone men use when they're embarrassed and trying not to sound it. Hemlock's supply wagon had dropped its rear axle clean into the frozen rut at the bottom of the street's only grade. The load, 200 pounds of fencing hardware and dry goods, sat tilted and locked, blocking the road out of town in both directions. 4 men were already pushing at the wagon bed with their shoulders, which was doing nothing, because 4 men pushing against 200 pounds of dead weight on a broken axle is just 4 men getting cold. Martha walked out of the store. She looked at the wagon the way she'd looked at Hemlock, not with anger, just with the clear-eyed attention of someone identifying a problem. She picked up the iron bar that had rolled from the wagon bed into the slush. It was 4 feet long and weighed what it weighed, and she carried it without adjusting her grip. She walked into the mud. It came up over her boot tops. She didn't look down. She found the point where the axle housing had sheared against the frozen rut wall, set the bar under the frame joint at the precise angle, and drove her weight into it. Not a jerk, not a heave, but a slow, controlled press that used her height and the full length of her legs and everything she had ever built in her back and shoulders. From 10 years of work that nobody called work because it was work women did. The axle cracked upward, the wheel seated, the wagon was free. The 4 men who'd been pushing stood with their hands at their sides. Martha pulled the bar out of the mud. She walked back to Pruitt's steps where Hemlock stood, his mouth open at a slight angle. She took the syrup bottle from under her arm, counted exact coin from the flat purse inside her coat, pressed the coins into Hemlock's palm, and closed his fingers around them with her muddy hand. She didn't look at him again. "Papers by Friday," Gideon said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Hemlock looked at the coins in his fist. "That's right." Martha was already walking north toward the road, up the ridge, the syrup bottle tucked against her ribs. The cabin sat against the rock face like something the mountain had coughed up and forgotten. One room, a sleeping loft with a ladder missing its 3rd rung, a stove that drew badly and left a grease of soot along the north wall. The chinking between the logs had dried and cracked, and when the wind came down off the ridge, it came inside with it. Clara was in the corner by the stove. She was small for 5, smaller than Martha had expected from the file she'd read. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, and both arms wrapped around them. She watched Martha come through the door with the flat attention of an animal that had learned not to run, because running sometimes made things worse. Martha set the syrup on the shelf nearest the stove. She did not crouch down to the child's level. She did not speak in the high, careful voice adults use when they are performing gentleness. She simply moved to the opposite side of the room and began taking stock of what was there. 7 days passed. On the 8th morning, Deputy Sears rode up the trail on a gray horse that looked as tired as he did. He had a document in his coat pocket folded in thirds with a wax seal that had already cracked in the cold. He read it aloud in the yard, his breath making small clouds that disappeared before the words did. 30 days. A county assessor would return to determine whether the dwelling constituted a fit environment for a minor child. Criteria included structural integrity, adequate food stores, evidence of education, and the presence of a stable adult guardian with recognized standing. He looked at Martha when he said that last part. One of the two men who'd ridden up with him said something to the other. The word he used was mule. The other man laughed through his nose. Martha was splitting wood. She did not pause. She split wood every morning until her shoulders ached, then kept going. She re-chinked the north wall using a mix of clay and dry pine fiber she pulled from the ridge above the tree line. She rebuilt the food cellar's shelving so the dried meat hung in rows instead of piled, which kept air around it and slowed the mold. She patched the loft ladder. She rehung the door so it seated square in the frame and stopped letting in the draft that had been pooling cold air around the stove's base. At night, after Clara was asleep in the loft, Martha worked by the fire. She had taken the broken parlor stove apart on the second day, a cast iron wreck with a cracked firebox and a seized flue joint. Most of it was trash, but the barrel of the flue pipe was good steel, and the firebox door's hinges were a particular gauge she recognized. She cut and bent and shaped by firelight, using the back of the axe head as a hammer and a flat river rock as an anvil, and whatever she was making, she kept, turned toward the wall when Gideon came in from his night checks. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. Clara watched from the loft ladder, sometimes fingers curled around the rung at eye level. She still hadn't spoken, but she had started sitting closer to the stove when Martha worked, and once, when Martha set a plate of cornbread on the floor near her, without looking at her or saying anything, the plate came back empty. On the 24th day, the clouds stacked up in the northwest and didn't move. Gideon stood in the yard and read them the way a man reads a page he's seen before and doesn't like. The temperature had been dropping since noon. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself, it just arrived and stayed. "How many days does that give us?" Martha asked from the doorway. He didn't answer immediately. "Storm like that comes down hard, maybe a day's warning, maybe less." 6 days left on the court order. Martha went back inside. She took the things she'd been building from the corner where she kept it and set it on the table in the full light of the window for the first time. Gideon looked at it. Then he looked at her. She picked it up, checked the mechanism, the way you check a thing you built yourself and know by feel, and set it back on the table without explanation. Outside, the first wind came down off Blackwood Ridge, like a door slamming somewhere far away, but getting closer. They came up the ridge at mid-morning, 4 of them on the county's sled. Hemlock sitting in front like a man who had already decided how the day would end. The storm had been building since before dawn, the sky the color of an old bruise, the wind moving through the pines in long, low pulls that bent the smaller trees sideways and didn't let them back. Gideon had left at first light to check the east trap line before the snow buried it. He'd said 2 hours. It had been 4. Martha heard the sled before she saw it. She was inside stacking the last of the dried venison on the reshelved cellar boards. Clara was in the loft quiet, the way she was always quiet, the way a child learns to be quiet when noise has sometimes meant bad things. Hemlock stepped into the yard and looked at the cabin, the way he'd looked at Martha in Oakhaven, with the patient disgust of a man who has already written his report and is only here to confirm it. Deputy Sears had the papers out before his boots hit the ground. Then the horses screamed. Not the sound horses make when they're startled. The other sound. The one that means something has already happened and is still happening. The mountain lion came from the tree line to the north, driven down by the storm hollow-ribbed, moving with the mechanical focus of an animal that has passed beyond caution into pure need. It hit the led horse at the shoulder, and both of them went down in the snow in a wreck of thrashing and noise that sent the other horse sideways into the sled's rigging. The four men from Oakhaven pressed back against the cabin's outer wall. Hemlock had lost his hat. His face had gone the color of creek ice. Sears had his pistol out, but his hand was shaking badly enough that firing it would have been a danger to everything except the animal. The cat was between them and the sled, between them and the horses, between them and any direction that wasn't the cabin wall. The door opened. Martha came out with the rifle across her forearm, the reconstructed piece, the one built from the wrecked stove's steel and the original stock, and the mechanism she'd spent 23 nights making function. She wore no coat. The wind hit her, and she stood in it without adjusting. She looked at the cat the way she looked at everything, with the flat, clear attention of someone solving a problem that has a solution if you stay calm enough to find it. The cat swung its head toward her. She raised the rifle, settled it against her shoulder, and waited 1 full second. Not from hesitation, but because she was calculating distance and wind and the animal's weight and where the shot needed to land to end the thing immediately and completely, because a wounded animal in a small yard with 4 useless men was a different problem entirely. She squeezed the trigger. The report cracked off the rock face above the cabin and came back as an echo. The cat dropped straight down into the snow and did not move again. The yard was very quiet except for the wind. Hemlock's back was flat against the cabin wall. His mouth was open. His official papers were somewhere in the snow near his feet, one corner already disappearing under fresh white. Martha lowered the rifle. She looked at the horses, one down, one still tangled in rigging, but standing. She assessed the standing horse's legs, found no injury, and turned back to the men. Hemlock had not moved. She walked to him. She took a fistful of his coat at the collar, not roughly, not gently, just with the grip of a woman who needs to move a thing from one place to another, and walked him through the cabin door. The others followed because there was nowhere else to go. The door shut behind them. The storm hit the ridge in full, then a solid wall of white that erased the yard, the tree line, the trail down to Oakhaven, and everything those men had believed about this mountain and the people on it. The storm did not let up. By mid-afternoon, the drifts had closed over the sled's runners and packed solid against the base of the cabin walls. There was no road down. There was no down at all, just white in every direction, and the sound of the wind working at the eaves like something trying to get in. The 4 men from Oakhaven sat where Martha had pointed to on the bench along the north wall, Hemlock in the chair nearest the stove, Sears on an upturned crate. Their coats were steaming in the heat. Their boots were wet through. Martha put the kettle on without asking anyone what they wanted. The cabin was warm, not the gasping warmth of a fire fighting a losing battle against a chinking and a drafty door, but the steady, settled warmth of a space that had been made to hold heat and did it without effort. The walls were solid. The floor was swept. The cellar hatch in the corner sat flush, and even in its frame and through it. When Martha opened it to bring up a tin of dried apples, the men could see the shelves, the rows of smoked meat wrapped in cloth, The root vegetables laid in sand, the labeled jars catching the firelight in amber and dark red. Hemlock looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his boots. Martha set 4 cups on the table. She poured, without ceremony, ginger tea from the dried root she'd cut and stored in the 3rd week. The smell of it moved through the room, and the men wrapped their hands around the cups before they had decided to. Above them in the loft, there was movement. Clara came down the ladder, 1 rung at a time, both hands gripping feet, feeling for each step with care. She reached the floor and crossed to the small wooden box by the window, where Martha kept the medical supplies. A roll of clean linen, a tin of pine pitch salve, a pair of scissors with the blades wrapped in oilcloth. The surviving horse was tied to the south post of the lean-to visible through the window. One of its forelegs had a long graze from the rigging tangle, shallow but ragged, the kind that goes bad if it's left. Clara had seen Martha dress the same kind of cut on a pack mule 3 weeks before, standing at Martha's elbow and watching every step with those dark, still eyes. She gathered the linen and the salve and went out through the side door into the lean-to, without asking permission and without looking at the men. Hemlock turned to watch her through the window. Clara worked on the horse's leg with the focused quiet of a child who had learned a thing properly and was now doing it. She cleaned the wound. She applied the salve with 2 fingers, the way Martha did, no waste, no excess. She cut the linen to length and wrapped it in the pattern that would hold through movement. The horse stood for her. No one in the cabin spoke. Sears set his cup down very carefully on the bench beside him. One of the other men had his eyes fixed on a point above the fireplace and was keeping them there. Hemlock reached into his coat. He took out the folded papers, the county order, the wax seal, long since cracked the language, inside naming Gideon Cole as unfit, and directing the removal of the minor child Clara Cole to the Calverton home for dependent youth. He looked at it. Through the window, Clara finished the bandage and patted the horse's neck, once a single, firm pat. The way you thank something that trusted you. Hemlock moved his hand toward the stove. He hesitated for just a moment. The hesitation of a man whose pride and his good sense are arriving at the same answer from opposite directions. Then he dropped the papers into the fire. The edges caught first, then the wax seal. Then the whole thing folded inward and went to ash. Martha at the stove did not turn around. She poured herself a cup of tea and stood at the window and watched the storm, and her face in the glass was the face of a woman who had known exactly what she was building for 30 days and had built it true. The storm broke before dawn. By the time the sun came up over the east ridge, it was already burning the clouds off in long, pale strips, and the snow on the yard lay smooth and unmarked, the way it only does in the hour before anything moves through it. The men from Oakhaven left without ceremony. Hemlock pulled himself up onto the repaired sled and kept his eyes on the trail down. He did not thank anyone. He did not look at the cabin. He looked at the ears of the horse in front of him and held the reins with both hands, and that was the whole of what he did. They were gone before Clara finished her morning cup of broth. Gideon had come back in the night during the worst of it, half frozen from the east trapline ice in his collar, and both hands numb when he came through the door. Martha had pointed at the stove and handed him a dry pair of socks and said nothing about the 4 men asleep against the north wall. He had looked at them and then at her and sat down by the fire and stayed there until morning. Now the yard was empty and the ridge was quiet in the particular way it gets after a storm. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied out like a room after everyone's gone home. Gideon stood at the fence post, the one Martha had reset in week 2, because it had been leaning and leaning post-rots faster at the base. He had his coffee. He was watching the trail down the mountain go from shadow to light as the sun cleared the tree line. He said it the way a man says something he's been holding for 30 days. How did you know her name? Not a question. The shape of a question, but the weight of something else entirely. Martha was at the chopping block. She set the axe down against it and reached into the front of her coat. She took out the small knife she kept in the inner pocket, 3-inch blade. Bone handle, worn smooth at the thumb rest. She turned the flour sack over in her hands, found the bottom seam, and cut along it in one clean stroke. The lining peeled back. She reached in and drew out a single folded page, thin as onion skin, creased into quarters and soft at the edges from months of being carried against her body. She held it out. Gideon set his coffee on the post and took it. He unfolded it carefully because it looked like it would not survive being unfolded many more times. It was a medical record, handwritten in the cramped script of a man who charged by the minute and wrote accordingly. The date was 14 months back. The patient's name at the top was Clara Cole, age 4. Below it in the notes column, 3 lines, father carried patient on foot, 20 miles overnight. Presented at dawn, hypothermic lower left lung, refused charity. Paid in full with pelts, sent away no room. Gideon's thumb stopped on the last 2 words. Martha took the page back and refolded it along its old creases. I cleaned that station 8 months. Floor's instruments the back room where they kept the overflow files. She tucked it into her coat again. I read everything they sent away. The pines at the ridge edge held the morning light along their upper branches and dropped shadow across everything below. I stood at the end of that line on purpose, she said. I knew what kind of man leaves 2 coins on a table for a woman no one else will take. I knew what he'd already paid for the thing he loves. Gideon looked at the trail down the mountain for a long time. His jaw worked once the way it does when a man is deciding whether the thing in his chest is something he is going to name out loud or just carry. The cabin door opened. Clara came out in her coat, 1 button missed in the middle, so the front sat crooked. She crossed the yard in the snow, not hurrying, and stopped beside Martha, and took a fistful of her coat in one small hand and held it. She looked up. "Mama," she said. It was the first word she had spoken in 4 months. It came out clear and certain as a plumb line, not a question, not a request. A fact she had decided on and was now stating for the record. Gideon looked at his daughter, then at Martha, then at the 2 coins he'd set on a table in Oakhaven, thinking he was buying someone to split wood. He picked up his coffee. He looked out at the ridge. "You want to rehang that cellar door this afternoon," he said. "It's been sitting a 1/4 inch proud on the left side since week 1. Martha picked up the axe. "I know," she said. "I left it for you."